If you grew up in Europe in the 1970s, you were probably familiar with that vague kind of fear. A bag left unattended at a subway station, an anonymous phone call warning of a bomb in a shopping center, a nightly news bulletin mentioning yet another attack, another group, another new name. But there was one name that rose above all the others, tied to all kinds of assassinations, bombings, and hostage-takings across the continent. That name belonged to the man the Western press called Carlos the Jackal. In the context of the Cold War, when the whole world was already exhausted by the threat of nuclear war, he appeared as the embodiment of a different kind of menace. Not an intercontinental missile, but a man with fake passports, secret suitcases, and carefully chosen targets. From Vienna to Paris, from London to Middle Eastern cities, his shadow kept security services constantly on edge. In this video, we will retrace the journey from a student influenced by Marxism to the man who became a symbol of international terrorism during the Cold War. Not to embellish any legend, but to understand how a person can go from the language of liberation to blind violence. And more importantly, to ask ourselves a question: where exactly is the line between a fighter for a cause and someone who spreads fear among civilians? Please note, this video aims to analyze one of the most enigmatic terrorist figures of the Cold War era. We do not endorse or romanticize any extremist organization or act of violence. To understand why an individual like Carlos could become a symbol of international terrorism, we have to step back and look at the backdrop of an entire era. The 60s and 70s were not only the time of rock music, anti-war movements, and student protests. They were also the years when the world was split in two by the Cold War. Every regional conflict, from the Middle East to Africa, risked turning into a proxy stage for Washington and Moscow. In the Middle East, oil pipelines, ports, and oil fields suddenly became the lifelines of the global economy. After the oil shock of the early 70s, people in Europe and the United States felt, for the first time, just how real it was. Decisions made by a group of countries thousands of miles away could send the price of gasoline, heating, and airfares in their daily lives soaring. A region once seen as far away now became the center of crises everyone had to pay attention to. At the same time, the story of Palestine became a political wound and a global symbol. For many young leftists around the world, images of refugee camps and occupied neighborhoods quickly became intertwined with the language of anti-imperialism and national liberation. Armed Palestinian groups emerged. Some chose the path of diplomacy, but there were also organizations that chose cross-border violence. On the other side, many Middle Eastern governments, intelligence services, and even major powers were ready to exploit these groups. Whoever fought my enemy could, for a time, become a strategic ally. The result was a murky network of ideals, money, intelligence, and violence. Gunmen could be freedom fighters in one newspaper, and cold-blooded terrorists in another, depending on where you stood on the political map. It was in this context that figures like Carlos appeared. They learned the language of national liberation, of Marxism, of anti-imperialism. They gained access to flows of money, passports, safe apartments, and were given the chance to operate on the international stage. The big question we will carry with us through the rest of this video is this: in an era when violence was seen by many sides as a legitimate political tool, at what point does an individual cross the line from political activism into terrorism? And is there ever a moment, amid bomb blasts and gunfire, when people like Carlos still see the real faces of the anonymous victims they have turned into instruments for their message? If you zoom in on the world map we've just been talking about, leaving the Middle East and Europe to look across the Western Atlantic, you'll find a name that begins very far away from all those explosions. Caracas, the capital of Venezuela. The place where a boy born in 1949 grew up in a middle-class family, amid oil, inequality, and endless political arguments at the dinner table. That boy's surname was Ramírez, but even the first name he was given already hinted at an unusual story. His father was a Marxist lawyer who admired the Soviet Union so much that he named his children after revolutionary icons. Ilich, Vladimir. The entire identity was a statement. For many people in the United States, Marxist is a concept tied to books or some ideological adversary out there. But for this boy, it was the atmosphere at home. His father believed the world was divided between oppressors and the oppressed, between empire and liberation movements. Those conversations, those leftist newspapers, those stories about Cuba, about Palestine, about liberation struggles, became the backdrop of his childhood. While his peers talked about football or music, he was taught that the duty of a young person was to stand on the side of history that was moving forward. Caracas in the 1960s was not a war zone, but it was hardly peaceful. Oil brought skyscrapers and cars, but it also laid bare a massive gap between rich and poor. In that context, an ambitious young man raised in the language of revolution easily saw the world through a black and white lens. Either you were part of the solution, or you stood on the side of the problem. For Ilich, the choice seemed obvious. He joined left-wing student groups, learned the language of struggle, and saw distant armed movements as romantic examples of courage. The important thing is this. At the beginning, that path still led through schools and books. In 1968, Ilich was sent to the Soviet Union, to the People's Friendship University in Moscow, where many students from the Third World were trained in the spirit of socialism. From Caracas to Moscow was not just a long flight, but a leap from the periphery to the center of an ideological system. There, amid lectures on Marxism-Leninism and stories of liberation, he began to believe that he was not just a student, but a potential fighter in a global war. And it was precisely there that the line between political idealism and the doorway onto the path of violence began to blur. From Moscow, Ilich's path did not stop at carrying Marx and Lenin into the lecture hall. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, a new focal point of the revolutionary movement emerged in the eyes of many international leftists: Palestine. Images of refugee camps, the Six-Day War of 1967, and the prolonged conflict with Israel became symbols of what they called the struggle against imperialism. For a young man from Caracas who carried Marxist ideals within him, that story was not just current news. It felt like a calling. If he was truly serious about the idea of liberation, he could not simply sit still in Moscow. From the student milieu, Ilich gained access to pro-Palestinian networks and gradually connected with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, one of the most prominent armed groups at the time. The PFLP did not just talk about revolution, they advocated the use of armed violence, from the battlefields of the Middle East to airports and cities in Europe. For many far-left youths then, this was where ideology was turned into concrete action. Ilich left the lecture hall environment to join training camps, learning how to use guns, explosives, and communication codes. From a political science student, he began to become an armed operative. What matters here is that the radicalization process did not happen like a switch being flipped. It was more like a chain of small steps, each one a little further. First came the belief that Palestinians were truly oppressed and needed protection. Then the belief that the international system, Western governments, and the United Nations had all failed. When political channels were seen as useless, violence began to appear as a reasonable, even necessary option. In that environment, Ilich was taught that attacking targets of Israel and of countries that supported Israel was part of a just war. Outrage at injustice was mixed with a romanticized image of the guerrilla fighter. At that time, the PFLP pursued a strategy they called internationalizing the struggle. Instead of fighting only in the Middle East, they brought the war onto airplanes, into airports, into symbolic buildings in Europe. Hijackings, hostage-takings, and attacks on diplomatic missions became messages sent to the entire world. In that logic, someone like Ilich became useful. He had a Venezuelan passport, spoke several languages, and understood both Western culture and leftist language. Step by step, he became a convenient link in operations outside the Middle East, and gradually became known within the network by the name the press would later use: Carlos. But seen from the victim side, what was happening was that the moral boundary was being pushed back a little more every day. When an armed group decides to plant a bomb in a supermarket, to open fire in a hotel lobby, or to target a businessman simply because he has ties to Israel, the question is no longer about the liberation of Palestine. It turns into another question. How many innocent people are you willing to kill so that the world pays attention to your message? At this stage, the operations in which Ilich took part or was alleged to be involved began to cause civilian casualties in London, Paris, and Vienna. No longer guerrilla fighters clashing with soldiers on a battlefield, but explosions in the midst of everyday life. Looking back at the history of the Cold War, this is the deepest fracture point. A young man who believed in liberation, who set out because of the Palestinian cause, ended up becoming a symbol of international terrorism. At what moment was the concept of struggle replaced by an obsession with making an impact, regardless of who the victims were? In the case of Ilich Ramírez Sánchez, the rest of the story will make the answer very clear. There, it is no longer about distant training camps, but about attacks that shook the whole of Europe at the time. Once he had stepped out of theory classes and training camps in the Middle East, Carlos began to build what the press would later call his own international terrorist brand. It was not just about carrying guns and planting bombs. It was an underground ecosystem of aliases, fake passports, safe houses, money, and weapons routes, running through multiple European capitals, all revolving around a single name that security forces in many countries had to know by heart. In that underworld, the real name, Ilich Ramírez Sánchez, almost disappeared. He used the alias Carlos on forged documents, in contact notebooks, and in encrypted cables. When French police searched a safe house in London in the early 1970s, they found weapons, passports under different names, and a copy of the novel The Day of the Jackal. From there, the British press put the two details together and gave him the nickname Carlos the Jackal, turning an armed operative into a global media symbol. Behind that movie-like nickname was a very real network. Carlos worked for the external operations wing of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, moving between Beirut, Damascus, Prague, Budapest, East Berlin, and Paris. Some states in the socialist bloc, for their own geopolitical calculations, turned a blind eye or quietly allowed him to use their territory as transit points. Apartments rented under false names, cars not registered to the right owners, warehouses storing weapons and documents. All of that formed a map that only a handful of people in the inner circle were allowed to see. The deeper he got, the more Carlos learned to exploit the media itself to reinforce his image. He liked to appear in sunglasses, long coat, walking calmly through tense scenes. Each attack, each hostage-taking, each message sent to the press was calculated not only for military effect, but also for its political impact. In the Cold War, when news agencies were always hungry for dramatic stories, the image of a global hired gun inadvertently became a product repeated over and over on television and front pages. But that brand did not stand alone. Around him was a network of allies and associates from many different groups. Some were Palestinian fighters, some were European far-left militants, some were simply document specialists or logistics experts. Carlos exploited the Middle East conflict, East-West tensions, and the far-left wave to recruit people, receive funding, and trade services for safe haven. Each ally was a new link, but also another risk of betrayal, arrest, and interrogation. What is notable is not only the number of attacks, but the way one individual could connect the political fault lines of an entire era. Carlos saw himself as an anti-imperialist fighter, but his methods of operation were very similar to those of a criminal entrepreneur. Building a brand, expanding a network, diversifying clients and sponsors. The uncomfortable question here is this. Without the Cold War context, without states willing to provide cover, could someone like that have gone as far as he did on European soil? And that very fame was also a double-edged sword. The more aliases, passports, and safe houses he had, the more traces he left in the classified files of security services. The image of Carlos the Jackal gave him power and inspired fear. but it also made him a top priority target for international manhunts. When the name Carlos is mentioned, Western media often talk about a terrorist legend with a cocky demeanor, and those photos of him wearing sunglasses in the middle of Paris or Vienna. But if you strip away all that morbid glamour, what remains is only a chain of very concrete crimes, with very ordinary people at the other end of the gun barrel and the block of explosives. Even before the notorious OPEC operation, Carlos's bloody mark had already been left on Paris. In 1974, a bomb exploded at the drugstore Publicis shopping center on Place Saint-Germain, killing 2 people and injuring more than 30. It was not a military base, not a strategic target, but a place where families took their children for ice cream and couples went on dates after work. For many investigators, this was the moment Carlos crossed the line, from someone who talked about armed struggle to someone willing to plant bombs in the everyday life of a city. The peak of the Carlos brand came on December 21, 1975, when he and an armed group stormed the OPEC headquarters in Vienna, Austria. That day, oil ministers from more than a dozen countries were meeting in a luxurious room where normally only diplomatic language and oil price figures were heard. Carlos's group burst in, opened fire, and killed 3 people in the first minutes: an Austrian policeman, a driver, and a security guard. More than 60 hostages, including ministers from Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Algeria, were herded together, tied up, and held at gunpoint. From the perspective of Europe in the Cold War, it was a nightmare come true. An international building in the capital of a neutral country was turned into a stage for a global drama of violence. Carlos did not just want to kidnap. He wanted to send a message. Nowhere is truly safe, not even the most heavily protected spaces. Aircraft were brought in. His group put a number of high-value hostages on board and flew them through several Middle Eastern capitals, bargaining and performing for the whole world to see. In the end, the hostages were released, but the message had been delivered. The name Carlos the Jackal flooded the front pages while the victims and their families disappeared into the small print. What is noteworthy is that after OPEC, Carlos's violence did not stop. It shifted fully into the urban space of Europe. In the early 1980s, he was held responsible for a series of bomb attacks in France, many of them targeting trains, stations, and crowded streets. In 1982 and 1983, these bombs killed a total of 11 people and injured nearly 150. For ordinary people in Paris or Marseille, this was no longer about some distant Middle East problem. It was about stepping onto a train car or walking past an office building and wondering whether there was an unattended bag, whether an explosion was waiting at the next corner. Prosecutors later described that bombing campaign as a form of diplomacy by terrorism. Each explosion was tied to demands: to release comrades, to protest French policy in the Middle East, to put pressure on governments that Carlos believed had betrayed the revolution. But if you look at the victim files, you do not see the names of generals or senior negotiators. You see postal workers, students, business travelers, mothers taking their children to the doctor. Those people never voted for or against Carlos. They were simply innocent civilians with no power in their hands. The irony is that the very way Western media constructed the image of Carlos the Jackal also helped turn him into a symbol. The nickname came from a fictional novel. It sounded both cinematic and cold. In reality, behind that name was a chain of cold-blooded actions, choosing targets that would easily draw attention, maximizing the level of fear, exploiting political fault lines between East and West, between Arab countries and the West. He knew that each bomb did not just destroy a corner of a street, but also destroyed the sense of security that European societies prided themselves on having built after the Second World War. At the strategic level, governments called this international terrorism. At the human level, if you listen to the testimony of survivors, you will find they are very ordinary stories. One man says he still cannot ride a train without looking around for an exit. A woman says that every loud noise on the street still makes her heart race, even though many years have passed. Carlos can say he fought for Palestine, for the anti-imperialist revolution. But his most direct legacy is the hundreds of people carrying scars on their bodies and in their memories, scattered across Europe. When we piece these fragments together, we clearly see a familiar downward slope. From Marxist theory classes in Moscow, to guerrilla training camps, to the OPEC meeting room in Vienna, to an ordinary train station in France. Every step was wrapped by Carlos in the language of ideals and a liberation cause. But at the end of that chain lay bodies covered with sheets in the morgue. The question for us as viewers, living in a world still full of injustice, is this: at what point do political ideals cross the line and turn into an excuse to disregard the lives of innocent people? And how can we recognize, early on, when someone is trying to turn legitimate outrage into a license for unlimited violence? As the story approaches its final stretch, the image of Carlos is no longer that of a man with a gun storming into the OPEC meeting room. In the late 1980s, he entered his 40s, his belly beginning to bulge, the once thick hair gradually thinning. The world was changing too. The Cold War was coming to an end. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Governments that had once shielded international revolutionary fighters now had to recalculate the diplomatic cost. Someone like Carlos, once used as a card in the game, gradually became a burden that was hard to justify to public opinion. After a period hiding in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, Carlos was granted asylum by Syria, living relatively quietly in Damascus with his German-born wife. But this was no longer the life of a free-ranging gunman. It resembled a kind of soft house arrest. The Syrian authorities did not want him to keep stirring up storms, but also did not want to hand him over to the West immediately. Carlos was required to remain silent, to avoid public appearances, in exchange for a measure of temporary safety. For a man who had been used to moving between capitals, staying in luxury hotels on forged passports, this was a form of decline that was very hard to swallow. In the early 1990s, after the Cold War, European and American security agencies simultaneously reopened case files from the 1970s and 1980s. Assassinations and bombings that had once been bundled under the label of political violence were now reviewed in the light of new anti-terrorism laws. Victims' families applied pressure. The press asked why a man who had killed and injured dozens of people and damaged multiple European cities could still live peacefully abroad. The name, Carlos the Jackal, reappeared in the headlines, this time no longer tinged with legend, but as a long-overdue debt of justice. Under international pressure, Syria's door gradually closed. According to many sources, the authorities in Damascus demanded that Carlos leave in the early 1990s. He moved to Sudan, a country that at that time had become a new meeting point for many international extremists. In Khartoum, Carlos lived under a false identity, still trying to maintain the illusion that he was a revolutionary leader with influence. But in reality, the old network had become dilapidated. State sponsors were no longer enthusiastic, and Western intelligence services were patiently waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in August 1994. With the cooperation of the Sudanese government, French intelligence sought to approach Carlos when his health was failing. According to released documents, he was taken to a hospital in Khartoum for treatment, unaware that this was part of a plan. Once the anesthetic took effect, French special forces put him on a waiting aircraft. When Carlos woke up, he was no longer in a Middle Eastern capital, no longer had forged passports, no longer had any ability to bargain. He was in the sky, on a special flight with no return ticket, heading straight for Paris. On the night of August 14th to the early hours of August 15th, 1994, the plane landed in France. The terrorist legend was carried down on a stretcher, surrounded by armed special forces. That image stood in stark contrast to the years he had strode through the corridors of luxury hotels, confident like a political figure. Now he was a prisoner, handcuffed, being escorted through the cold corridors of the judicial system he had spent his life trying to defy. The following years were a chain of long trials. In 1997, a special criminal court in Paris sentenced him to life imprisonment for 3 murders in 1975, including 2 French security officers and an associate. Later, he was tried again and received additional life sentences for the early 1980s bombings that killed and injured many people. Carlos constantly tried to turn the courtroom into a stage, delivering political speeches and presenting himself as an anti-imperialist fighter. But beneath that, the victims' relatives still sat there carrying photos of their loved ones and wounds that never fully healed. Today, Carlos Ramírez Sánchez is still serving his sentence in a French prison, growing old behind bars, while the world has moved into a different era of terrorism with new names and organizations. His path from Marxist student to terrorist legend did not end with a death on the battlefield, but with concrete walls and a dense court schedule. For us, who are trying to understand the history of political violence in the 20th century, this collapse is a reminder that every terrorist brand, no matter how many layers of idealism it wraps itself in, ultimately has to face something very old: justice, even if it comes late. When the cell door closed behind Carlos, the hardest question began. What was he, in the end? A hero against imperialism, as he claimed, a cold-blooded terrorist in the eyes of the victims' families, or just a loud instrument of an era that used violence as its political language? On European streets today, cafes have been renovated, train stations are more modern, but for those who lost loved ones in the bombings, the memory of the explosions and the ambulance sirens never grows old. It is a reminder that whenever we want to believe violence can replace dialogue and the rule of law, those faces reappear. Once you turn morning commuters, shoppers, children on airplanes into targets, every justification in the name of ideals falls away. No matter what flag you wrap yourself in, bombs going off in a city are still terrorism. If you feel stories like this are important, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share the video so we can continue making the next episodes. Thank you, and see you in the next videos.